Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Human Stories, we retell those moments, honest, everyday, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. The first sting of gin didn't come from a glass, it came from a memory. I was standing at my kitchen sink watching the evening light turn the maple leaves on Sycamore Lane the color of old brass when a thought pressed against my ribs: how quickly a voice can sound warm when money enters a room. I shook it off, rinsed the teacup, and told myself to focus. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been hunched over the counter of Klein's Market in Brookhaven, clutching a lottery ticket I'd bought with quarters from the coffee tin. The clerk scanned it twice, then lifted his eyes with the caution you use around dogs that might bite. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "I think you need to sign the back." The numbers were a ladder straight to the sky, $2 million before taxes, but in that moment, all I felt was the cool tremor of disbelief moving through my hands. I am 67, and nearly every paycheck I earned as a third-grade teacher went to the prosaic mortgage utilities, sensible shoes, classroom glue sticks I bought when the supply closet gave up. I walked home slow that afternoon, the ticket zipped into the inside pocket of my coat as if a brisk wind could lift it away. By the time I reached my porch, my heart was banging like an old radiator. I called my son Daniel. "Mom!" His voice came bright, surprised, then effusive. In the background, I heard a high, delighted squeal that had to be Lena, my daughter-in-law. "We have to do this right," he said. "Let me plan something you shouldn't lift a finger." There are phrases that burrow into your chest because they sound like love. I wanted to believe him. Since Lena had arrived 5 years earlier in a silk blouse and careful opinions, Daniel had become a visitor to his own childhood home. We were cordial, we were fine, we were, if I'm honest, a little formal. Perhaps that's what money was offering me, a chance to warm the glass between us. For 2 weeks, I moved through the days as if they were a set of polished stones. I met with a banker named Ruth, who wrote numbers on a pad and slid them toward me without pressure. We spoke about mortgages, taxes, prudent baskets. "Slow and steady protects you from yourself and everyone else," she said. I took notes. I repeated them aloud on the walk home like lines I needed to learn for the play of my life. Daniel called more often than he had in years, every other day, sometimes twice. "How are you feeling about it all?" he asked, and I told him the truth. Dizzy, then calm, then dizzy again. "Lena says her firm's finance guy is a wizard," he added once. "Only if you want another opinion." I said I was all set with Ruth and felt his brief silence like a draft. We settled on Saturday for dinner. Daniel insisted on bringing everything to my place. "It's your night, Mom," he said. "Let us handle it." Lena, who I had never seen interested in anything as ordinary as my stove, offered to oversee the menu. I spent Friday cleaning a house that was already tidy and left my windows open to invite in the smell of rain. Saturday morning, I went to the salon on Main Street where Kira set my silver hair with the care of a seamstress threading pearls. I bought a dress on the way home, ink blue, with a field of tiny forget-me-nots that swayed when I turned. It cost more than I've ever paid for something that wasn't necessary. It felt necessary. By 5 o'clock, the dining room shone. I laid my mother's china on a linen cloth ironed so flat the edges looked like paper. The candlesticks, heavy brass with a nick at the base from the year Daniel and his cousin used them as swords, watched over the table like familiar sentries. In the mirror above the sideboard, I caught my own expression and saw a woman who looked a touch younger than she had that morning. "Hope will do that to you." The doorbell rang at 6 on the dot. Daniel came in first with his shoulders full, paper bags cradled like infants, a bouquet of dusky roses clenched by the stems. "You look gorgeous, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek with the quickness of someone rushing to apologize for a decade of short goodbyes. Lena followed, dressed as if she were stepping into a boardroom. Crisp blouse, black trousers, a leather case at her side that didn't look like it belonged to food. "These are for you," Daniel said, setting the roses on the counter. They were the exact color of a bruise fading, which I only noticed because I was trying not to notice Lena's smile. It reached her mouth. Whether it reached her eyes, I couldn't say. "You shouldn't have gone to such trouble," I told them, arranging the flowers in my tallest vase. "Nonsense," Lena said, the word wrapped in honey. "Brookhaven's newest millionaire deserves elegance." She moved around my kitchen like a consultant, opening drawers she'd never used and extracting precisely what she needed. Daniel began unloading containers: buttered asparagus, scalloped potatoes, something in a copper pan that smelled of cream and mushrooms. I lifted a lid and nearly laughed. This wasn't Lena's cooking. The labels read, Maison Vivante, the French place near the river where entrees felt like someone else's mortgage. We ate like people who wanted to be seen eating well. Daniel poured wine from a bottle with a label that whispered in a language I don't speak. It tasted like a small apology. "To you," he said, lifting his glass. "To Windfall's landing in good hands." I raised mine and tried to keep my gratitude from spilling over. Lena took a sip and looked around my dining room as if weighing its square footage against a memory. Evelyn, she said my first name, which she rarely used. This place has character. Very authentic. She let the word linger, and for once I decided not to rescue it. We talked, or we performed a version of talking while the food cooled by degrees. Daniel listened carefully when I described meeting with Ruth, nodding at the words conservative and diversified. Sensible, he said. Though there's also the question of impact. He glanced at Lena. Money can do a lot when it's not just sitting in a drawer. I don't own any drawers large enough for $2 million, I said, and he laughed, but it was brief. The air had the strange buoyancy of a room at high altitude, bright a little thin. Lena told a story about a client in Athens, the one in Georgia, not the Acropolis, and Daniel added details that suggested he'd heard it twice already. I watched the way their eyes met in the pauses, a quick exchange like someone passing a baton in a relay. I have taught enough children to know the difference between kindness and strategy, and yet I wanted the kindness. I wanted the part of the evening that wasn't a test. So I asked Daniel about his latest project at the firm, and he told me about deadlines that sounded like weather. He asked if I thought about travel, and I said there were places you can't really imagine until your feet are finally pointed in their direction. He said he'd draw up a list. He's good at lists. When the candles burned low, Lena set down her glass with a precise little click. Families, she said lightly, are at their best when they make decisions together. Daniel's mouth lifted at one corner. To family, he said again, and we clinked. I heard the clock in the hallway mark the hour. I heard, too, the soft zipper of Lena's leather case as she slid it a little closer to her chair. The dishes were cleared, the table breathed. I gathered plates and took them to the sink, and on my way back I touched the back of Daniel's head the way I used to when he was small. He smiled up at me with the tired sweetness of a man who wants two things at once. I stood for a moment at the edge of the room and let myself keep a small private hope that all of this, the food, the fuss, the laughter leaning in, was as simple as it looked. Outside, the streetlights hummed. The roses drank from their tall glass. The house, my house, held its breath the way old houses do when they're listening. I blew out the candles and relit them because the room felt prettier that way. Then I sat down again at the head of the table, folded my napkin across my lap, and waited for the night to keep being what it had promised to be. I kept my hands folded on the table and let the candles do their quiet work. The room had the hum of a stage set just before the lines that matter. Lena's leather case sat beside her chair like a small obedient animal. Daniel topped off my glass and then his own, the bottle tilted in the practiced way of someone who knows when to make a pour look generous. It's good to sit like this, I said, meaning it. It is. Daniel answered, and for a heartbeat the three of us were only a family at dinner. Nothing more complicated than glasses, plates, and the familiar creak of the dining room chair where the leg had needed glue after the summer of cousins in fort building. Then Lena unlatched the case. The sound was soft, but it changed the air. She drew out a manila folder thick enough to have weight and set it squarely on the tablecloth, aligning the edges with the same neatness she used to arrange the cutlery she'd never once washed in my kitchen. I brought something that will make this easier, she said. Easier than what I asked. Daniel's smile pinched at the corners, not unkindly, simply tight. Just hear us out, he said. Lena slid the folder toward me. My name wasn't on it. Hers was, though, in the neat, indifferent print of a corporate mail merge Lena Ward account summary. Under that, the letterhead of a firm I'd never seen, Cardinal Asset Recovery Group. The first page wore numbers like bruises. At the bottom was a figure that sat in the white space as if it had rights there. 847,000, Lena said, because her voice couldn't leave the number alone. It isn't all principal. Fees pile up, the market well. Market? The market, I repeated, turning the next page. There were lists, resorts I'd only seen on travel shows, boutiques with names that sounded like perfumes, restaurants where the appetizers came on stones or slates or boards reclaimed from barns wealthy enough to die beautifully. Also a lease statement for a German car that looked like a shark when it passed me on Route 9. Also a personal line of credit. Also a refinance of a refinance that brought in less air every time it tried to breathe. Daniel reached across, covering my hand with his. His fingers were as warm as when he was a feverish child, and I sat up with him in a chair that left a line in my back. We didn't want to blindside you, he said. We wanted to explain everything. Then explain it, I said, not pulling my hand away. Lena took a breath that gathered patience like fabric. The hospitality industry is about presentation, she began. Image isn't frivolous, it's a tool. When I moved up to regional accounts, there were expectations. Clothes, travel, client dinners. The firm reimburses some things, but there's a lag and limits, and sometimes you front costs to close a deal that won't wait for a purchase order. It made sense while the commissions were strong. And when they weren't, I asked. She raised her chin a notch. You bridge. You invest in keeping your seat at the table. I turned another page. There were the Bridges cash advances at interest rates I wouldn't wish on anyone, minimum payments that nibbled while the principal fattened. I taught children to make a raise out of pennies. You line up enough columns and even a small mistake becomes a wall. It got away from us, Daniel said softly. The timing didn't help. What timing? He glanced at Lena with a look that asked permission and received a nod. Corporate restructuring, he said. Lena's position was eliminated in June. I looked at Lena. You didn't mention that at Thanksgiving. There were interviews, she said. There still are. I didn't want to broadcast it. So you've known what 3 months for? 3, Daniel said. And this is the first time you've told me. He let out a breath that wanted to be a sigh and disciplined itself not to be. You didn't have the kind of resources that could help, he said almost apologetically. We didn't want to add worry. I placed a fingertip at the bottom of the page where the 8 and the 4 and the 7 sat like a code you can recite without comprehension. But now I do, I said. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Lena folded her hands. Her nails were the pale pink of a color that pretends to be shy. Evelyn, she said, I know the number looks enormous. It is. But numbers have stories. A lot of this is tied to leverage that can be negotiated down if we move quickly with a lump sum. Cardinal works with settlements. We've spoken to a consultant who believes some accounts could be closed at 40 to 50 cents on the dollar if we act before they escalate to litigation. Who is we, I asked. Family, she said. Families navigate storms together. Daniel squeezed my hand. We're not asking you to take care of everything, he said, though the figure on the page suggested otherwise. We're asking you to help us get to a place where we can breathe and rebuild. You've always said we look after each other. I've always said that I agreed. Lena's tone softened. You're 67, you don't live extravagantly. Even if you set aside half your winnings for security, you'd still have more than enough for comfort. We're simply asking for a portion you won't really feel. Something in me cooled, a portion I won't really feel, I repeated. She smiled a smile I recognized from the kind of woman who can move a room. I mean that with respect. You've lived sensibly. You know how to do a lot with a little. This is a moment when you can do a lot for people you love without sacrificing anything essential. I didn't know I had nothing essential left to sacrifice, I said. Daniel's thumb moved as if to soothe a small bird. Mom, he said, we're not attacking. We're trying to make a case. If we let this run its course, collections turn into judgments, and judgments turn into things that affect everything. My work, our home. It's not just Lena. It's both of us. I took back my hand gently and turned another page. There were letters with dates and warnings printed in confident font. There was a timeline that made its way toward a cliff in tidy regular steps. There were notes in Lena's tidy hand beside this line, and that little markers of intention call negotiate combine. She had planned. She had not planned for me. Before tonight, I asked, did either of you call to ask for advice? For a listening ear, for anything other than a checkbook. Silence showed itself honest and bare. We thought we'd bring a plan, not a problem, Daniel said. Lena leaned forward, elbows just shy of improper for the linen. We're proposing a loan, she said. Not a gift. We'll formalize it. Interest schedule collateral. I'm returning to work. There are 2 offers in play right now. Returning to work when I asked. Soon, she said. Which is not a date, I said. Her mouth changed shape. She smoothed it flat again. Daniel cleared his throat. Could we talk about a number? It would help to know what you're comfortable with. I looked past them at the roses catching the candlelight. The petals had opened another finger's width since we sat down. I'm comfortable with you not drowning, I said. I am not comfortable with being told the depth of the water means I should empty the reservoir. Empty. Lena stopped herself. A careful breath. Evelyn, we're not asking you to ruin yourself. You don't get to define what ruins me, I said, still calm. I do. She sat back. The smile left her eyes properly now that it had room. What are you going to do with $2 million? She asked, soft and incredulous. You live alone. You have a small house. You cook at home. You don't take trips. Lena, Daniel said, warning threaded through the syllables. No, she went on, still soft, still incredulous. She could change our lives with a signature, and she's deciding where her money lives, I said, which means it does not live in your past purchases. I lifted the top sheet and turned it around, reading aloud with the same even cadence I'd used for decades when a room full of 8-year-olds needed to hear that the rules applied. Maison Vivant, $7 or $20, multiple visits. Nordfell Boutique, $14,980. Valette Leather, $9, $200. Lago Azul Resort, $6,300. Ridge and Field Motors, BMW. Financial, $1,218 monthly. Client Hospitality Atlanta, 3 entries each over $2,000. These were business-facing expenses, she said, tightening. Business-facing, I repeated. But they're facing your personal cards. That's how it works sometimes. And sometimes it doesn't, I said. Daniel rubbed his temple. Mom, please, let's not turn this into a trial. I looked at him. He had my father's ears. They reddened when he was embarrassed. They were reddening now. I softened my voice without changing my answer. You came here to make a case, I said. Cases have documents. They've given me theirs. He sagged an inch. What would help, he asked. I stood and went to the sideboard where I keep a little box that used to hold recipe cards and now holds things like the address labels charities send you uninvited. Beneath those was my checkbook. I returned to the table and sat. The way women have been sitting to handle money since money learned to come in leaves. I wrote a number and signed with a steady hand. I tore the check and laid it directly on the folder without sliding it or tapping it or presenting it. A rectangle of blue. Lena didn't touch it. Her eyes moved as if the ink might change its mind and grow another digit. $1,000, she said finally. Yes, I said. My minimums are higher than that, she said. Then the problem is larger than me, I said. Daniel looked at me like a man watching a bridge he hoped would hold. Mom, he said, soft and pleading. This doesn't have to be adversarial. It isn't, I said. It is me telling you the truth at a table where I have eaten the truth and served it and said it and washed it. I will not fund this. Lena reached for her glass. She picked it up the way some people pick up arguments decisively, clear liquid and an olive perfectly pierced. She stared at the check as if the number insulted her upbringing, which perhaps it did. Then she tipped her wrist. The martini left the glass in an arc that would have been beautiful if it had not been meant for a face. It traveled cleanly, crisp as a slap. The gin found my eyes. The brine found my mouth. The shock found my body, which flinched the way a body will when cold lands on skin faster than anger can arrive. Lena Daniels' chair skidded. What are you doing? She was already standing. Refusing to be humiliated, she said. Her breath came high. She wants to make a point with that check. Let her feel a point. I took a napkin and dabbed my cheeks calm because something in me had already crossed a line I hadn't known was there. The dress I'd bought for this night absorbed what it was given. So did I. When I looked up, I used the voice that quiets a room without raising itself. Sit, I said. They both did reflexes its own muscle. I folded the wet napkin once, twice, 3 times, until it was a neat, damp bandage resting on the linen. Let's be very plain, I said, each word a step placed carefully on a stair you've walked in the dark. I will not give you $847,000. I will not give you something close to that. I will not loan it to you with terms you will not meet. I will not decide that because I love my son, his wife's choices should live in my bank account. I am offering what I can afford without lying to myself. This is the extent of my support. Lena's mouth twitched at the corner. Support, she said, tasting the word for irony. You're hoarding. It's my money, I said. You think survival is an excuse to be small. I think survival is survival, I said. Daniel pressed his palm to the table like a pledge. Mom, she's under immense pressure, he said. We both are. We're not thinking clearly. That was out of line. He shot Lena a look that admitted as much. We'll cover dry cleaning, obviously. I'll handle my dress, I said. You handle yourselves. Lena laughed once the sound of crystal chipped on the rim. And if we choose not to, she asked. Then you will have chosen not to, I said. She shook her head in a pitying way I have seen on women who believe their pity is a credential. You'll die with money you never used, she said. Leave my dying to me, I said. Daniel's hand slid an inch toward the check, not to take it, simply to remind himself it existed. He looked at me like a boy who can't find the firefly he promised to show you. You raised me to show up, he said. To be useful, to take care of people. I'm trying to take care of my family. You are, I said gently. Decide who that includes. He flinched and covered it with a swallow of wine. Lena collected herself with visible effort, like a woman smoothing a skirt caught on a nail. All right, she said. We've been polite. We've made a case. We've been met with $1,000 and a sermon. No sermons, I said, just limits. She stood again, and this time her chair did not scrape. It glided. She gathered the pages into the folder with brisk hands that had likely sealed 100 deals. She tucked the check under the top flap. She didn't look at Daniel when she spoke. We're finished here, she said. I rose and walked to the front hall. I opened the door. The evening was cool and blue at the edges, the way it gets when the last of the light is deciding what to do with itself. The porch bulb made a soft circle on the step. Somewhere down the block, a dog announced the arrival of a squirrel or a ghost. My house smelled faintly of lemon oil and olives. Daniel came to the doorway and stopped the threshold a stubborn line. Mom, he said, tired. Don't do this. I already did, I said. He looked past me into the dining room and then at the roses on the counter and then at the street as if each held a different promise of relief. Can't we find a middle, he asked. We did, I said. Lena crossed in front of him, her heels exact the leather case tucked under her arm like victory. She paused just long enough to angle her face toward mine without turning her shoulders as if her body couldn't afford even that small concession. "You'll regret this," she said. Not a shout, not a hiss, just a sentence cool as the glass she'd emptied on me. "You'll be alone with your money and no one to share it with." "I hear you," I said. She stepped onto the porch. Daniel hesitated. For a second, I saw the boy who used to run back for one last hug as if the extra second would change the quality of the first. He didn't run back this time. He looked at the floorboards at the worn place where the mat had rubbed the finish at my shoes at the lamp at the dark. Then he followed his wife. I waited until the shape of their car left the square of the window. I closed the door and turned the bolt. The house gave a little settling sound the way old houses do when a draft leaves or arrives. In the dining room, the candles burned down to a shorter kind of certainty. On the linen, the damp napkin rested like a punctuation mark that knows where a sentence ends. I gathered plates and stacked them in the sink, letting the water run warm without adding soap. The roses had opened a little more. I lifted them, trimmed the stems, changed their water, and set them back by the window because routine is a rope your hands can find even in the dark. On the table beneath the stack of papers Lena had reclaimed, a single page had slipped free and remained. I picked it up without curiosity and found a line item I had already read and was now reading as if it had just learned how to pronounce itself. No shock, no surprise. Just the fact of it printed neatly in ink that would outlast the names. I folded the page once and slid it into a drawer. Then I poured the last inch of wine and sat in my chair, the one at the head, not because heads matter, but because habits do. The gin had dried on my skin and in the fabric in the room and would need washing. For now, the air held a faint brightness from the lemon oil on the sideboard. I let my shoulders lower slow as a curtain that knows its cues. The clock in the hallway kept time with the modest pride of something that had never been late without a reason. When I stood to blow out the candles, a small flick of wax fell and cooled on the brass, making a pale coin. I picked it away with my fingernail and dropped it in the trash. Then I turned off the dining room light and moved through the dimness toward the kitchen, where the window made a rectangle of night on the floor. I rinsed my hands, dried them, and folded the towel over the oven handle exactly in half, because the things we can make even we should. In the quiet, the house breathed with me. The streetlight hummed. Somewhere a neighbor's screen door whispered and clicked shut. I stood there for another moment, long enough to feel the room return to itself, and then I began to clean. I woke before the alarm, the kind of waking that arrives not from rest, but from a clean, bright edge in the mind. The house had the washed silence of a Sunday at dawn. I boiled water, buttered a heel of bread, and sat at the kitchen table with a pen and the yellow pad I reserve for lists that matter. The table still smelled faintly of lemon oil and juniper. The napkin I had folded into a damp bandage the night before was dry now, a little stiff with its history. I began writing what was said, who said it the time the doorbell rang. The names printed on the folder, the number crossed and recrossed in my head until it steadied into ink. I wrote the arc of the drink as if I were describing weather for someone who had to travel through it. I wrote where Daniel's hand had tried to be a bridge and where Lena's voice had become a knife wrapped in silk. I wrote the check's amount and where I placed it. I wrote that I opened the door. By 8, the pad held the bones of a record. I slid it into a drawer with other documents that know their purpose and washed my face, rinsing away the last of the brine. When the kettle began to rattle again, I called Ruth. She answered on the second ring, voice unhurried as if steadiness were a service she provided. "Good morning, Evelyn. I need to protect a portion of the funds," I said. Ruth didn't ask why, how much, and how fast. "More than half," I said. "Soon. We can establish an irrevocable trust," she said. "I'll arrange a meeting with our estate council. Today, if you like." "Today," I said. Ruth paused and I could hear the click of her pen somewhere on the other end of town. "Bring identification and any documentation you think is relevant," she said. "We'll keep this as quiet and straightforward as possible." Before I could thank her, the phone in my hand shook with another call. Daniel's name, the letters suddenly too close. I let it ring until it stopped. It rang again, again. I placed the phone face down on the table. I was not a bell to be rung. Ruth met me at 11 in a glass-walled conference room that offered a view of treetops and clouds, the kind of corner that makes people feel wise for choosing it. A woman from legal joined us. Her card read, Amrita Thakur-esque, and spoke in clear, precise lines: grantor, trustee, successor, spendthrift clause, creditor protection. We drew a circle around 60% of the winnings and placed it where no one could reach without a key I did not intend to hand out. I initialed here, here, and there, and then signed where the blue tab asked for my name. "Is there anyone who might challenge this?" Amrita asked. "There are people who misunderstand where my money lives," I said. Amrita nodded as if I had answered with statutes. "This will help them learn geography. When I returned home, the answering machine, the old one in the hall I keep, out of habit, blinked with messages. 3 from Daniel, 1 from a number I didn't recognize, and another from Daniel again. I pressed play and listened to the first 2 seconds of each before pressing stop. My body knew the tone already. I didn't need the words. At 4, a knock. I looked through the peephole and found no one I knew, just a uniform and a kind face under the brim. I opened the door. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said. "Officer Ruiz. We received a request for a wellness check." "From whom?" Caller identified himself as your son, Daniel Hart. Said you weren't returning calls and there was concern. "I am well," I said. "I am not returning calls because I am choosing not to." He shifted his weight, not unkind. "Is anyone here with you?" "No." "Any history of—" He stopped himself and tried again. "Are you safe tonight, ma'am?" "I am safer than I was last night at 6:30, I said. "Would you like to come in and write down a statement about why you're here? It may be useful for me later." He hesitated. Officers are taught not to step in when they don't have to. But then he nodded and followed me to the hall table. I dictated the summary of my own well-being while he filled the boxes. When we were done, he offered his card. "If anyone harasses you," he said, "call the non-emergency line and reference this visit. We'll have it on file." "Thank you," I said. He opened his mouth to say something else, thought better of it, tipped his head and left. Through the glass, I watched him descend the steps and speak into his radio with the relaxed cadence of someone closing a loop. The next morning brought an envelope I didn't recognize, thick paper firm type. Harland & Rowe, a firm from downtown. The letter used my full name in a tone that had been polished by decades of expensive advice. Our client, Ms. Lena Ward, has grave concerns regarding financial exploitation and undue influence. There was a sentence about my recent windfall. There was a request for a competency evaluation. There was the suggestion that failure to comply would result in appropriate action. I read it twice and then a third time, feeling not fear, but the crisp clarity you get when a thunderhead shows you exactly where it intends to go. I placed the letter beside the yellow pad in the drawer and pulled out the business card of an attorney whose name Ruth had once pressed into my hand for the file. "Naomi Park, Elder and Trusts." Naomi answered with the voice of a runner at mile 3. "Park," she said. I told her what had happened. Dinner folder number, drink check, door officer letter. And when I finished, there was a small silence on the line that felt like the pause between a diagnosis and the plan. "We'll respond in writing," Naomi said. "We'll also file a petition for a protective order if you consent. If they're alleging incompetence, we will demonstrate the opposite with your paperwork, your financial decisions, and the fact that you sought counsel. Keep documenting everything, times, names, messages. Forward me the letter and any texts. And Evelyn, yes, don't respond directly to them. That includes mothers-in-law, cousins, and anyone who claims to be mediating. Have them speak to me." Before noon, I had scanned and emailed the letter, photographed the caller ID log, and sent Naomi a copy of the wellness check card with Officer Ruiz's notes. I placed the phone on silent and made a pot roast because hunger arrives even when lawyers do. At 3, a text from an unknown number flashed once across the dark screen before being corralled by the filter I'd installed years ago. "This isn't over. You'll regret treating family like this. L." I screenshotted it and included the metadata. Naomi replied within the hour. "Good. Keep all of it." 2 days later, we were in a courtroom that smelled of polish and patience. The walls held portraits of men whose cheeks had known razors and women whose hair had known pins. Naomi sat beside me, legal pad aligned with the corner pen uncapped and not yet writing. Across the aisle sat a man with a briefcase too new to belong to a person of judgment. He introduced himself as Mr. Denby of Harland & Rowe. Lena sat to his left in a navy suit that wanted to be more than fabric. Daniel took the seat beside her and looked at his hands with the concentration of a person memorizing the geography of a mistake. "Case number 21C-1087, the clerk intoned. Ward v. Hart." Judge Ellery Shaw entered with the unhurried gait of someone no longer proving anything. He took his seat, looked over the docket, and then at us. "Counsel," he said, "I've read the filings." Denby rose. "Your Honor. Our client seeks an evaluation of Ms. Hart's competency in light of a sudden acquisition of substantial assets and concerning indications of isolation orchestrated by outside actors." "Which outside actors?" Judge Shaw asked. Denby gestured vaguely as if I had a cabal tucked under my cardigan. "Financial advisors," he said. "Possibly others who benefit from restricting familial contact." Judge Shaw's face did not change. "You're suggesting that retaining a banker and an attorney is evidence of undue influence. We're suggesting patterns consistent with exploitation." Naomi stood. "Your Honor, we have entered into evidence Ms. Hart's banking history, her conservative investment choices documented well before the lottery ticket, the irrevocable trust executed with counsel, present a police report noting a wellness check initiated after Ms. Hart declined to provide funds to Ms. Ward, and text messages threatening unspecified consequences. We also have photographs of the injuries to Ms. Hart's clothing after Ms. Ward threw a drink in her face when presented with a check for an amount Ms. Hart could responsibly give. Daniel's head lifted at the word threw. He opened his mouth and closed it. Judge Shaw adjusted his glasses. Ms. Ward, he said, addressing Lena directly, do you dispute that you have personal consumer debts totaling in excess of $800,000? Lena's mouth made a small contained shape. Some of those amounts are fees and interest, negotiable. That was not my question, the judge said. She glanced at Denby. There is significant debt, Your Honor. And you believe Ms. Hart is incompetent because she declined to extinguish those debts. We believe Ms. Hart is being manipulated to withhold support that in any reasonable family would be forthcoming. Judge Shaw looked for a brief and startling second like a man who wanted to laugh at a dinner table and was deciding not to. He turned to Denby. Counsel, the court is not a mechanism for converting disappointment into orders. There is no cause to compel a competency evaluation. The petition is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, given the tenor of these filings, I am issuing on Ms. Hart's counterpetition a limited protective order. Ms. Ward and Mr. Hart are enjoined from contacting Ms. Hart about money or assets directly or through third parties. Any future communications on other matters will be made through counsel only. Denby began to object. The judge lifted a hand. Additionally, I am granting Ms. Hart's motion for costs. Have your client prepare to pay reasonable attorney's fees associated with this response. If there is a subsequent attempt to repackage this claim, I will entertain sanctions. The gavel did not bang. It merely existed quiet and grave while the words did the work. We rose. Papers were shuffled, the kind of rustle that follows the moment. People realize their story is not the only one in the room. Naomi touched my elbow lightly the way good guides do when a step is uneven. In the corridor, Danielle caught up to us. Mom, he said, the syllable breathy as if it had spent the morning running laps. Can we? Naomi moved half a step to position herself between us without making a scene of it. Mr. Hart, any further contact should come through counsel, she said. I'm her son, he said almost to remind himself. Yes, Naomi said, which is why you'll respect her boundaries. He looked over her shoulder at me. I could have said his name, I didn't. Back home, the house met me with the small dignities it knows. Light along the floorboards, the reliable tick in the hall. I removed my jacket and draped it over the chair. On the way to the kitchen, I lifted the roses and cut their stems again. They had lasted longer than roses usually do, as if determined. In the days that followed, letters shifted from threat to concession. Naomi forwarded a note from Denby requesting clarification on the scope of the order. She responded with 3 sentences that could have been etched on glass. I received an envelope from the court with a stamped copy of the dismissal, and the order attached the paper heavy with a kind of calm. Then the story left the inside of my life and walked a small distance into the world. A reporter from the Brookhaven Ledger called Naomi for comment. Naomi said what good lawyers say, the record speaks for itself. The paper ran a column anyway, names, omitted contours, unmistakable about the rise in family disputes after windfalls and the quiet ways older adults make their own weather. A local radio segment picked it up. The host read from a list of red flags and invited listeners to call in with experiences. I didn't listen live, but people mentioned it in line at the post office, and the cashier at Klein's Market said she'd always liked how I counted change, like you're making sure the world stays fair. I found it curious that public interest accrued to a story I would have preferred to keep folded in a drawer. But curiosity is different from welcome, and privacy is a room you can re-enter once you've aired it. I kept watering the garden. I learned the name of the neighbor's new dog. I slept well enough. On a Wednesday, Naomi called to say the fee check had cleared. Harland and Rowe, she said. Note the handwriting. Associates hated writing that one. Thank you, I said. You did the hard part, she said. You made decisions. That afternoon, a light rain came in from the west, the kind that makes leaves strum. I moved the patio chairs under the eave and watched the yard take the gift. The damp sharpened the scent of soil and the soft green of the hostas. On the kitchen counter, the last of the roses finally gave up and let their heads bow. I carried them to the sink, thanked them without words, and clipped the blooms into the compost pail, where they became something else. Toward evening, the phone rang with a number I didn't know, and I let the machine take it. A woman's voice measured kindly identified herself as Lydia Crane, a producer from a regional TV station. She said they were doing a segment on protecting elders from financial pressure, and wondered if I might speak generally about working with advisors and setting boundaries. No names, no particulars, she promised. Just the importance of writing things down. I stood in the doorway and listened to her voice tint the hallway a shade warmer. When the beep invited my reply, I pressed the button and said, "Thank you for thinking of me. Please send details to my attorney, Naomi Park. If she approves, I'll consider it." I left my number out of the message and went back to the stove where a pot of soup had decided to be simple. The next day, a postcard arrived from a woman in a neighboring county whose name I did not recognize. She wrote that she'd seen the column in the Ledger and that it made her feel less odd for having told her nephew no. The card had a watercolor of a harbor on the front boats, at rest ropes coiled the suggestion of a bell you couldn't hear but believed in. I placed it on the mantel, not as a trophy, as a weather report that matched my window. When I took the trash out that night, the sky was the deep blue that almost remembers black. Somewhere a late train mentioned itself. I stood for a minute and let the air do what air does. The porch bulb drew a soft flock of moths. They tapped at the light like small, polite visitors who never intend to come in. Inside the dining room was dark, the brass candlesticks faint shadows against the mirror. In the morning, I would polish the wax coin from the base I'd missed. For now, I locked the door, turned off the hall lamp, and let the house settle around me the way a book closes when the chapter ends on a period, not a flourish. It was late on a Thursday when the doorbell rang again. I checked the peephole and found Daniel alone, his hands empty. The porch light made him look both older and less certain, like a photograph that had been left in the sun. I opened the door and stepped back. He didn't cross the threshold until I nodded. "I won't stay long," he said. "I just need to say something without a lawyer in the room." He stood in the entry where the floorboards narrow. The house held him in a small, careful silence. "I'm sorry, Mom." The words came out without preparation, no ribbon on them. About the dinner, about the letter, about asking you to fix something I didn't even try to name. I let him talk. He told me the firm had moved him to a project that didn't require clearance anymore. He said he'd filed for divorce the day after court, that Lena had called it abandonment. His voice didn't try to make her a villain. It didn't have energy for that. He reached into his coat and brought out a folder, thin and gray, the sort that looks like nothing until it opens. "I found this in her desk," he said. "I thought you should see." At the table under the brass candlesticks that had watched more defiance than ceremony lately, I slid the pages out. Copies of my homeowner's policy bank balances with the decimals, carefully preserved printouts from public databases that had no business being so interested in one woman's life. There was a page about guardianships in the county court highlighted in yellow. Another on how to petition for conservatorship when an elder appears to be making unsound financial decisions. In the margins in Lena's steady hand physician letter capacity exam timeline, I put my palm flat on the stack. The paper was cool. The room, if it had blood, kept it quiet. "How long?" I asked. "A while," he said. "Dates go back months before the lottery." He was looking at the candlesticks, not the papers. I didn't know. I should have. "Knowing and wanting to know are different," I said, because it was the only sentence that would come. He nodded a small grateful tilt. "Naomi should have copies," he added, "if you want them." "I do," I said. We sat there with the folder between us, the way people sit with a sleeping child they're afraid to wake. He asked if he could make coffee. I said yes. He found the filters in the same drawer they'd always been in and washed 2 mugs that were already clean. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, setting a cup in front of me. "I'm not sure I would if I were you." His thumb rubbed the rim as if it were a coin. "I want to try to be your son again. Not your case file, not your problem." The hall clock ticked, the kind of time that doesn't push. I tasted the coffee and felt the heat settle. "I never stopped being your mother," I said. "That's its own kind of problem." He exhaled like a man who'd been holding a door shut against weather. "I'd like to come by sometimes, to help with the gutters or the storm windows." He glanced up finally, "to sit here and not talk about numbers." "Sometimes," I said. "We'll see." He nodded. He didn't ask for a schedule. He didn't offer one. He stood, gathered the empty cups, rinsed them, and set them upside down on the towel in a neat line. At the door he paused, hand on the frame, the way he used to when he was small and asking for permission without saying the word. I didn't make it easier by giving him a script. He squared his shoulders and let himself out. I locked up and returned to the table. The folder waited where I'd left it. I made copies in the study and slid the originals into an envelope with Naomi's name on it. Outside, a light rain stitched the porch into something softer. I set the envelope by the front door so I wouldn't forget, then went to the sink where the last rose had finally let go. I trimmed the stem to an angle that pleased the vase, and finding there was no vase that would do, laid the bloom flat on the counter. Its petals were still perfect, even with nowhere to stand. Made you reflect? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.